Hello and welcome back to Photoshop CS6 for web designers. In this video, we're going to talk about a few tools in Photoshop that help us in laying out our objects in our Photoshop file. Namely, we're going to talk about the Photoshop grid, and then we're going to talk about rulers and guides. I want to start off talking about the grid just because it's the one that I hardly ever use myself, but it can be very, very useful if you know how to use it properly. Now we can turn on the grid by going to the View menu, Show, and then Grid. You can also toggle it off and on if you're using a Mac by hitting Command apostrophe, or if you're using a PC, it would be Control apostrophe, and that would toggle it on and off. Now, as we talked about in the last video, we need to be careful when we're setting up our file. We need to be careful to use pixels instead of inches or centimeters because we're designing for the screen. We're not designing for print. So we're not concerned with inches, we're concerned with pixels. And it's the same thing for the grid. If we go to our Photoshop menu, go to Preferences, and then Guides, Grid, and Slices, under the Grid section, we can see that by default it's set for a grid line every inch. Obviously, we're not dealing with inches, we're dealing with pixels here, so I'm going to change that to, let's say, every 100 pixels. So we could do that and then click on OK. And that would customize our grid for our use because we don't want to use inches. We want to use pixels. But again, as I mentioned, I don't use the guide very much. It can be very helpful. For example, if we wanted to draw some shapes here and we wanted them to stick to this grid, we could make sure that snapping is turned on. You go to the View menu, Snap to, and then make sure that Grid is checked. If it's not checked, you can click on it, or you could click down here on All, and it will snap to all of these different options. So once we have snapping turned on, we can then use our rectangle tool, for example, and click and drag out, and you'll notice it's snapping to these guides. So we could very quickly create some kind of layout that snaps to these guides if we wanted to. Again, I don't use them all that often. But some people find them very, very useful when laying out their designs in Photoshop. I'm going to delete these rectangles, and I'm going to talk about something that I personally find more useful, and that's rulers and guides. Guides are basically kind of like a custom grid that you can create for yourself that you can snap objects to in Photoshop. And in order to get your guides to work, you need to have your rulers turned on. Now, rulers are these bars that you see at the top and left side of my Photoshop window here, and it basically just shows us our position on the stage in pixels. Now, again, we want to make sure that this is set to pixels because I believe by default it's set to inches. So again, you'd go to your Preferences menu. On a Mac, it's under the Photoshop menu. On a PC, I think it's under the Edit menu. But we'll go to Preferences, Units and Rulers. And here we can set our rulers to whatever unit of measurement we want to use. And by default, I believe it's set to inches. I'm going to leave it set to pixels. So make sure that you change that appropriately if you're going to use rulers in your Photoshop file. So let's click on OK. And one of the really helpful things here, if you'll look over here on the right in the Info panel, if you don't have this Info panel visible, you can go to the Window menu and click on Info and it will open up. But if you pay attention to this X and Y coordinate here on the Info panel, as we hover over our document, you can see those values changing. And that's telling you exactly where your cursor is located in the coordinate system of your Photoshop file. So if you wanted to draw a shape that starts 10 pixels from the upper left-hand corner of your stage, we can just hover up here until we see those XY values change to 1010. And then click and drag out to start creating whatever shape it is you want to create. I'll hit Command Z to undo that. Well, now I want to talk about how we can use these rulers to create guides. Well, in order to do that, we can click on one of these two rulers. If we click on the left ruler and drag out, we'll create a vertical guide. And if we create on the top ruler and drag down, we'll create a horizontal guide. Now, dragging them out like this isn't necessarily the most precise way to do it. For example, you might have noticed as I was dragging out, it's trying to drop these at weird locations, like 300.8 pixels. If we move it over, and now it has a whole number, but if we keep moving it, now it says 540.3 pixels. So we don't want to drop any of these rulers in between pixels like this. We want that to be a whole number. And sometimes if you zoom into 100%, right now we're zoomed out by default. You can tell by looking in the lower left-hand corner of your Photoshop document, it says 66.67%. So we're actually zoomed out right now. But if we hit Command 1 or Control 1 on a PC, that'll zoom us into 100%. And sometimes you can get away with that, but you'll see it's still actually trying to drop this in between pixels. It's saying 34.9 pixels right now, for example. So that's not going to work for me. I want to be more precise about where I'm placing these rulers. So let's clear our guides for now. We can go to the View menu and click on Clear Guides, and that'll get rid of all the guides that we've made. And let's try doing this a more precise way. So I'm going to move in my document. You'll notice we have some scroll bars here that we can use to navigate through our document, but I find it much easier to use the move or the hand tool, which you can get to just by holding onto the space bar. If you hold onto the space bar, you'll see your cursor changes to a hand, and then we can click and drag to move to a different portion of our document. So I'll just drag until the top left corner of our document is close to the top left corner of our screen, and then I'm going to create a new guide using the New Guide command in the View menu. So we'll go to View, New Guide, and then we can choose whether we want a horizontal or vertical guide, and then we can enter in specifically what position we want to put it at. So if we wanted to put a 20 pixel gutter around the edges of our screen, we can put one at a position of 20 pixels, click on OK, and you'll see it puts a new guide 20 pixels from the left-hand side of the stage. Now our current file is 960 pixels wide, so if we wanted another guide 20 pixels from the right-hand edge of the screen, we would need it at 940. So we could go to View, New Guide, Vertical, 940, hit Enter, and there we go. We could also create a new guide 20 pixels from the top edge of the stage by clicking on New Guide. And we'll do a horizontal guide this time at a value of 20 pixels, and there we go. So that's a much more precise way to add your guides to the stage. Another important thing to point out is that your guides will snap to objects that are on your stage. So if I had a rectangle in the middle of our stage and I started to drag out a guide, you'll notice that it's snapping right to that left edge of the guide, or the left edge of that rectangle, excuse me. And if we come over here close to the right, it'll snap to the right edge of that rectangle. Similarly, if we go near the center, it will snap to the vertical center of that rectangle, which can be very handy when you're creating guides to help align other objects with an object that's already been created. But it's very important to understand how this works, because it can get in the way as well. So if you're ever dragging out a guide, let's hit V to switch to the Move tool, which is this tool in the very top of our toolbar here. And with the Move tool, we can actually grab one of these guides and move it around. But if you're ever dragging a guide around and it keeps snapping to an object that you don't want it to snap to, looks like I accidentally created another rectangle there. Let's delete that. So we have this rectangle layer selected, and you'll notice that this guide keeps trying to snap to it. But if I didn't want to snap to that rectangle, an easy way to get around that is to simply select the background layer. If we click on the background layer and then try to move that guide around, you'll notice it's not trying to snap to the edge of that shape anymore. So anytime you're trying to snap a guide to an object, just make sure that you have the layer for that object selected before you start trying to snap the guide to the object. Otherwise, it's not going to work. Similarly, if your guides keep snapping to an object that you don't want it to snap to, then it's a lot easier just to select the background layer and then drag out your guides, and that will make things a lot easier. Also, if you have the background layer selected and we drag out a guide, it will snap to the center of the document, which is at 480 pixels. So if you need something centered, it's very easy to drag a guide out to the center of the stage simply by selecting the background layer and then dragging out a guide until it snaps to that center position like so. So let's create the guides that we need for our particular file. If we look at our final file here and turn it on, I'm going to hit Command H to turn on our guides. You can hit Command H to toggle those off and on, or Control H if you're using a PC. And for now, I'm just going to create the boundaries of the document itself. I'm not going to create all of these in-between guides just yet. We'll get to that a little bit later. But for now, I just want to draw out a guide that's going to denote the left and right edges of our content. Now remember, I mentioned before that I want our content to be 960 pixels wide. Now our final file here is actually 1200 pixels wide because I included some extra space on the left and right margins so that we can see what that texture is going to look like outside the boundaries of our content. But our content itself is just taking up 960 pixels. Well, as I mentioned when I first created this document earlier, let me get rid of that rectangle there. I'm also going to clear the guides for now. We're going to start over from scratch. As I mentioned earlier, we created this document at a width of 960 pixels. And I did that for a reason. Even though it's going to end up being 1200 pixels wide, I started it off at 960 pixels wide. And the reason for that is it's very easy to drag out guides and have them snap to the boundaries of the document. Now, if it's not snapping there, make sure that you go to the View menu, and first of all, make sure that Snap is checked. Make sure there's a little check mark next to Snap, and then go to Snap To, and make sure that there's also a check mark next to Document Bounds. That way, when we click and drag out a guide, it will snap right to the edges of the document. And so now that we've got those two guides in place, we can change the width of our document appropriately. So I'm going to go to Image, and we're going to go to Canvas Size, and now we can now change the width of our document. I'm going to change it to 1200 pixels wide, and then make sure that under this anchor section that the dot is right here in the middle. If we put the dot on the left-hand side, then our document will expand out to the right, and if we do that, you'll see that we have all of this extra space over here, but nothing over here on the left. So our guides aren't centered in the document. So I'll hit Command Z to undo that, and then we'll go to Image, Canvas Size. We'll change the width to 1200 pixels, and then again, make sure that anchor point is right in the center. You can click in any of these portions of the shape to change it, but I want it right in the center so that it expands out to the left and to the right. Click on OK, and now as you can see, now it's not all the same color here, but as you can see, our guides are now centered in our Photoshop document, but they're still 960 pixels apart. Now, I don't want this other color on the edges, so I'm going to change that. I'm going to select white for the foreground of our color picker. Another way you can do that is you can hit D. That'll switch to the default colors of black and white. And we now have black for the foreground color, white for the background color, and we can click on this little two-sided arrow here to swap those colors around so that white is now in the foreground. And then we can go to Edit, Fill, and for the contents, we're going to use the foreground color and click on OK. So that fills the entire width of the stage with that solid white color. Now I've already saved this file once as fredsphotos001.psd. I'm going to save it as a new version now. I'm going to go to File, Save As, and I'm going to save this as fredsphotos002.psd, and I'm saving all of these files in the Project Files folder so that you can follow along if you need to. So again, fredsphotos002.psd, we'll save that, and we'll move on to the next video where we'll start talking about the history panel and what it means to undo an action in Photoshop, because it works a little bit differently than it does in other programs. So again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.